Dustvale baked beneath the high sun like an old wound, dry and angry. The wind whipped grit against boardwalks and battered saloon signs, carried with the scent of old tobacco, rusted iron, and something fouler, desperation. Elias Boone shifted in his saddle, the leather creaking beneath him as he reined his horse outside the general store. He hadn't planned to stay long, just a sack of oats, kerosene, maybe some nails. But the town didn't let a man pass through easy, not when the wind was uneasy and voices carried sharp. Jed rode up beside him, tall and silent as ever. The boy had his mother's eyes, storm-colored and still, though the rest of him was Boone through and through, broad, bristled, slow to speak. Samuel trailed behind, younger by 3 years, wiry and thoughtful, always with a book tucked in his saddlebag. Elias trusted them both, but in different ways. Jed could hold a line. Samuel could see past it. Then came the noise, laughter that didn't sound like joy. A small crowd had gathered outside the saloon, circling like buzzards. Boone heard the word auction, and his stomach coiled. He dismounted slowly, boots crunching on the cracked dirt. Jed glanced at him, questioning. "Stay close," Boone muttered. They moved through the crowd, parting it by the weight of their presence. Elias Boone wasn't famous, but he was remembered. The kind of man folks didn't meet twice unless they meant to. At the saloon steps stood a man with a bloodied hand and a grin soaked in whiskey. His coat hung open, revealing a pistol he likely didn't know how to use. A card dealer's smile split his unshaven face. "Gentlemen," the man said, lifting a bottle, "welcome to the finest deal Dustvale's ever seen. Flesh and future, right here. My own kin, 3 of 'em." Behind him stood the girls. They weren't dressed up or made to look like something they weren't. They stood as they were, tired, thin, worn at the edges. The eldest held her chin high, jaw tight as iron. Her eyes scanned the crowd with the precision of someone already bracing for the worst. The middle one kept her arms crossed, like they were the last defense she had. The youngest clutched a rag doll to her chest, blinking through tears too old for her years. Elias felt something shift in his chest. A soundless crack in the dam. Amos Crowley. That was the man's name. Elias hadn't seen him in over a decade, but he remembered the voice. Too smooth for the dirt it crawled from. Crowley had been a gambler, a drunk, a coward with loud hands. And now he was selling what blood hadn't yet abandoned him. "Starting at $10, Crowley said, slapping the eldest girl on the shoulder. "This one's strong. Good back. Doesn't talk much." Nobody laughed. Not anymore. Elias watched. Jed stood stiff beside him. Samuel looked like he might be sick. "Any takers?" Crowley said louder. "Ain't no law against it. They're mine. Signed and witnessed. Debt's a debt." The crowd began to thin. Not out of shame, just discomfort. Dustvale had seen its share of filth, but this reeked too loud. A few lingered, shifting, uncertain. One man, coal-eyed, a miner maybe, spoke up, offered $7 and a saddlebag of tobacco. The girl didn't flinch. Elias stepped forward. Crowley squinted at him, that grin faltering just a little. "Boone!" Elias said nothing. He walked to the foot of the saloon steps, reached into his coat, and pulled out a small cloth sack. He tossed it in the dirt. The jingle of coins stopped the wind. "No bidding." Elias said, "They're coming with me." Crowley let out a laugh, but it was thinner than before. "You buying all 3? What for?" Elias looked at the girls. "That's not your concern." The man bristled. "That ain't enough." Elias unbuckled his rifle, leaned it slow against the post. Then he looked Crowley in the eye, and all the noise left the air. "You don't want to finish that sentence." Crowley's breath hitched. For a long second, he looked like a man measuring odds he knew were against him. Then he spat into the dirt and raised his hands, grumbling. "They ain't worth the trouble anyhow." The eldest girl stepped down on her own. She didn't thank him, didn't look afraid either. The middle followed after her, steady but tense. The youngest hesitated, until Samuel knelt and offered his hand. She took it. No one spoke as they walked back through town. The crowd parted again, quieter now. Some looked away. Some stared like they were trying to read a future they'd never know. Elias hoisted the girls into the back of the wagon. Jed took the reins without a word. Samuel helped him settle on a bed of feed sacks and canvas. The youngest clutched her doll, curled beside Rosie. Elias guessed the name by the way the middle one whispered it. As the horses plodded out of town, the sun began to bleed toward the horizon, casting long shadows over plains. The wind picked up, smelling of smoke and somewhere far off, rain. They didn't speak until Dustvale was nothing but a smud behind them. Elias rode beside the wagon, glancing back only once. The eldest caught his eye. "You think you saved us?" she asked, a voice like gravel underfoot. Elias didn't answer. She turned away. "Don't matter. I ain't yours." He looked ahead, the sky wide and waiting. "No," he said finally. "You're not." And that was the truth. They weren't his. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But they were his burden now. And he carried burdens better than most. The Boone ranch sat like an old scar on the prairie, distant from the road and forgotten by most maps. Wind scraped its fences and whispered through the dry wheat, brushing the porch railings like ghost fingers. The main house was timber and shadow, 2 stories leaning into the wind, stitched together by repairs done more with necessity than pride. There was no white picket fence, just land and the silence that came with it. The wagon creaked into the yard late, the last orange light falling behind the hills. The girls hadn't spoken much since Dustvale. June, the eldest, kept her eyes forward, lips pressed tight. Rosie drifted between silence and short glances toward Samuel, not out of trust, more like testing the shape of something unfamiliar. Maybelle had fallen asleep, her small frame curled against a folded saddle blanket, doll still clutched in her grip. Elias dismounted first. He felt the ache in his knees, the throb in his shoulder that winter hadn't healed right. He wasn't old, not truly, but years on the trail and grief in the bones made a man older than time would admit. He reached up to help June down, but she brushed past him, jumping off the wagon without a word. Rosie followed more hesitantly, catching Samuel's offered hand, then letting go before she was even steady. Maybelle blinked awake, confused, until Jed lifted her gently and carried her like a father might, though he'd never held a child before. Inside, the house smelled of wood smoke and coffee long since boiled dry. The hearth crackled, half-hearted, as if unsure of its place among strangers. A stew pot simmered on the iron stove, something Elias had thrown together in the morning and forgotten. The girls stood in the entryway like animals unsure if the trap had already sprung. "You'll sleep in the loft for now," Elias said, voice low. "It's warm. Roof don't leak." He didn't wait for thanks. June nodded once and took Maybelle's hand. Rosie lingered, then followed. They disappeared up the creaking staircase, boots heavy on the steps, and the house seemed to hold its breath. Jed sat near the fire, rifle laid across his knees, jaw tight as fence wire. "You think they'll stay?" Elias poured himself coffee that had turned bitter hours ago. "Don't know. Don't expect gratitude." Samuel leaned against the wall, arms crossed. "They're not cattle, Pa." Elias looked at him, not unkindly. "Did I say they were?" "No, but you didn't say much else either." He let that sit between them. The next morning came without sun, just a cold wind and clouds that hung low, like judgment. The girls came down in silence. June tied her hair back and went straight to the chicken coop, unasked. Rosie found the pump and started scrubbing the wash basin. Maybelle sat on the porch steps and hummed her doll, the same tune over and over, soft as a prayer. By evening, the silence had taken shape, a rhythm of distance. No one asked questions. No one gave answers. But things got done. The coop cleaned. The stew thickened. Tools mended. Boots placed neatly by the door. Elias watched it all without comment. He'd seen men talk holes into the earth. He'd seen women stitch up holes with thread and silence. That night, he called them together. The fire snapped as they sat, his sons on one side, the girls across. No one touched the food yet. Outside, the wind rattled the tin on the barn roof. Inside, it was the truth that creaked. "I ain't a savior," Elias said, "and I don't believe in charity. What happened in town, Crowley, was wrong. You know it. I know it. But I didn't bring you here to feel better about myself. Rosie's eyes narrowed. Then why? Elias met her stare. Because I had room. Because I had sons who needed women who don't faint at the sight of dirt. Because maybe you needed a place that didn't smell like whiskey and rot. He let that land. June's voice was calm, but edged. And now what? We're supposed to what? Marry them. Jed shifted, uncomfortable. Samuel looked down. I'm not forcing anything, Elias said, but I am offering it. A place, a name, protection if you want it. June's laugh was bitter and short. You offering freedom like it's a wedding ring. No, Elias said, I'm offering shelter. What you do with it's yours to reckon with. They ate in silence after that. The next day, June and Jed began working the west fence together. Not talking, just mending one post at a time. Sweat in the cold air. Tools passed without words. Rosie began tending the small garden plot with Samuel, who showed her how to check soil by touch and crumble. She listened more than she spoke. By the third day, June came in from the field, mud to her knees, and nodded once at Elias. We'll marry, me and Jed. But I picked a day. Elias didn't smile, just nodded back. Fair. Rosie said nothing, but began sitting beside Samuel in the evenings, near enough to share the lamplight, but far enough not to seem eager. Maybelle slept easier, her nightmares less frequent, and sometimes Elias would find her watching with wide, quiet eyes as he sharpened knives or patched saddle leather. Then one evening, just as the sun broke through a crack in the clouds and painted the whole sky in copper, Elias stepped out to see a rider on the hill. Crowley, drunk again or pretending to be. His coat hung crooked. His boots were caked in dust. He stayed atop his horse like a man who knew his legs wouldn't carry him far. He didn't wave, just stared down like a crow picking its spot. Elias didn't fetch a rifle. He didn't yell. He just stepped to the porch, arms crossed. You can't keep him, Crowley called down. They're mine. My blood. Elias said nothing. The wind filled the space between them. You hear me? Crowley shouted, louder now. They'll come back. Girls always come back to blood. Elias finally spoke, voice low but sure. Then you best hope they never do. Crowley stared a beat longer, then turned his horse with sloppy jerk and rode off toward the horizon, where night already stretched its long fingers. Elias went inside, lit the lamp, and sat at the head of the table. June came down from the loft, mud still on her hands. Rosie followed, brushing soot off her apron. Jed nodded once. Samuel opened his book, but didn't read it. The room wasn't quiet. It was full, and for the first time in a long while, Elias Boone felt something in his chest that wasn't just a weight of loss. It was the beginning of a family, not by blood, not yet, but by choice. And choice, out here, was everything. The fire started just before dawn, when the air was still, and the stars hung low like eyes that refused to blink. It was the barn, old, dry, aching for flame. Elias woke to the smell before the sound, smoke threading to the floorboards like a warning whispered too late. By the time he and Jed burst into the yard, the sky was already glowing orange, embers dancing like fireflies on the wind. Samuel hauled water from the pump, Rosie beside him, her bare feet cutting through the frozen dirt. June ran toward the chickens, shouting for Maybelle, who appeared in the doorway of the house, confused and blinking, her doll dangling from one hand. They worked fast, too fast to think. The fire took the east wall in minutes. By sunrise, there was nothing left but char and the black skeleton of beams. Elias stood at the edge, chest heaving. He knew fire, knew what it said. Someone lit this. He found it that afternoon, a rag soaked in lamp oil stuffed behind the tool shed. Too precise for accident, too cruel for nature. June paced in tight circles, fists clenched, boots crunching over scorched soil. He came back, she said. Last night, maybe while we slept. Elias nodded. Crowley doesn't care about winning. He wants to spoil the field. Then let me go finish it. Her voice was sharp as flint. Let me take the rifle and... No, Jed said, stepping forward. Not alone. June stared at him, jaw tight. You want to hold my hand, or hold me back. I want to stand beside you. That quieted her, but only for a moment. Samuel spoke from behind them. There's a difference between defending a home and starting a war. Elias looked at each of them, his sons, his daughters now by some fragile thread, and felt the weight of the past rising again like smoke. This was not the first time he'd lost a structure to vengeance. This was not the first man who thought ruin could replace regret. "I'll go," June said. "He's hiding in the hills. Same place he used to drink through the cold." "I know it." Jed picked up his rifle. "Then we go together." Elias didn't stop them. He only walked to the well and dipped his hands in the freezing water. When he looked up, they were already riding out, two figures against the snow-flecked prairie. That night, the wind came in hard. Maybelle cried in her sleep, small whimpers that made Elias sit beside her bed until her breathing eased. Rosie stayed awake in the kitchen, staring at nothing, her hands trembling as she folded a dishcloth again and again. "He said we were his blood," she whispered. Elias didn't reply. The kettle hissed, the only sound between them. "He used to keep Maybelle in the cellar when he was drunk," she went on. "Told her monsters would eat her if she made a sound." Elias's jaw flexed. "He's a monster." Rosie turned to face him, eyes hollow. "You think if June kills him, it ends?" "No," he said, "but it'll stop getting worse." She blinked at that, then stood and crossed the room slowly. Without asking, she placed her hand on his good shoulder, just a brief touch, like anchoring a ship that hadn't realized it was drifting. Then she walked back to her room, quiet as snowfall. The next day came without word. Then the next. The barn remained a ruin. The chickens huddled near what was left of the coop. Samuel did his chores like a man counting breaths. Elias fixed the fence with his left hand, favoring the arm that hadn't taken a bullet 15 years ago. Rosie sang sometimes while she worked, not real songs, just pieces, unfinished melodies that curled around the wind. By the fourth day, Jed and June returned. They rode in just after dusk, cloaked in cold and silence. Jed looked tired. June looked changed. She walked differently, shoulders tighter, eyes harder, not colder, but deeper, like a well newly dug. Crowley wasn't dead, but he was broken. "He won't walk for a while," she said, not meeting Elias's gaze. "Anyone else?" he asked. June nodded. "2 men. Gone now." Elias didn't ask how. He only nodded once, then turned and went to the shed to fetch hammer and nails. There was work to be done. Still, that evening, they all sat at the table, the fire throwing shadows across the walls. Maybelle climbed onto Elias's lap, her hair still damp from the wash basin. She no longer flinched when someone raised their voice. She no longer checked the corners of the room before stepping inside. Samuel passed the bread. Rosie poured coffee. Jed and June sat close, not touching but not far. It was strange, Elias thought, how silence had softened when it came from peace instead of fear. Later, when the moon was high and the land lay still, Elias stepped onto the porch and lit his pipe. The barn remained a black outline in the yard, but it no longer smoked. Snow had begun to fall, soft flakes catching on the collar of his coat. From inside, he heard June's laugh, quiet, short, but real. Jed's low voice followed. Somewhere upstairs, Maybelle sang to her doll, a lullaby that hadn't been sung in years. The night smelled of ash and frost, but it also smelled like something new. He didn't know if the blood debt had truly ended. Men like Crowley didn't vanish clean, but the girls weren't afraid anymore. And his sons had found something more than duty. They were building something again, not just a barn, not just a house, a home. And tomorrow, the land would remember. The snow came heavy that week, laying over the plains like a white shroud. It softened the land, silenced the wind, made the world look clean even when it wasn't. Inside the Boone house, heat from a hearth painted gold across wooden floors. The barn had been rebuilt, smaller than before but sturdy. Smoke rose from its chimney, where Jed worked late into the night shaping new harnesses. June sometimes joined him, hammering nails without asking where or why. Their conversations were few, but their silences had changed, warmer now, threaded with understanding. Elias sat at the table one evening, a worn ledger open before him, though he hadn't written a thing. Rosie stood at the stove stirring beans, humming under her breath. Samuel rested nearby with Maybelle curled beside him, both reading from the same book, her finger tracing the lines as he whispered each word. The knock came like a gunshot. 3 slow raps on the door. Measured. Mean. Elias stood, old instincts flaring. Jed was already outside, footsteps crunching toward the porch. June moved quicker than most could follow, pulling the rifle down from the mantel with calm hands. Rosie stilled, lips parted. Samuel slid Maybelle behind him, eyes fixed on the door. When Elias opened it, the cold slapped him first, then the sight of 6 men on horseback, their shadows long and lean beneath the moon. Crowley sat at the front, wrapped in furs like he was a king. His leg was bound tight, boot cut open, pain gritted across his jaw. But his eyes were sober now, clear and bitter as black ice. "You've got something that belongs to me," he said, voice flat. Elias didn't answer. Crowley glanced over his shoulder at the hired guns, rough men, the kind who kill without bothering to remember names. "I'm here for the girl. The youngest. She's blood." "She's not," Elias replied, stepping fully into the doorway. "Not anymore." Crowley's lip curled. "You think paper and prayer make you a father? You think a few months in your house wash out years of name and right? She chose her family. You lost that right the day you sold her like a mule." Crowley's hand moved to his belt. One of his men shifted, drawing his coat aside just enough to show the glint of metal. Elias felt June step up behind him, rifle at the ready. Jed emerged from the barn, a hammer in one hand, shotgun in the other. Samuel hadn't moved, still standing between Maybelle and the door. "I won't ask again," Crowley said. Elias's voice came low and quiet. "You won't get another chance." The night snapped. Gunfire bloomed in the dark, short and violent. Jed fired first, dropping the man to Crowley's left. June's shot cracked next, striking a second before he could clear his holster. Samuel threw himself over Maybelle as bullets shattered the windows. Rosie pulled her into the kitchen crawl space, wrapping herself around her like armor. Elias stepped into the yard, firing with method, not rage. His second shot hit the third rider, who fell with a sound more grunt than scream. Crowley's horse reared, panicked by the noise. The 4th gunman dismounted and rushed forward, pistol drawn, but Jed met him halfway with the butt of his shotgun. Silence fell fast. 3 men dead. 1 fled into the dark. The snow bore prints like wounds, still falling, covering the blood even as it cooled. Crowley lay in the dirt, leg twisted beneath him. The pain stole his breath, but not his hatred. Elias walked to him, rifle lowered but steady. "You got any sons?" he asked. Crowley coughed, spat red. "None worth knowing." Elias nodded. "Then there's nothing left to pass down but shame." He turned to go, but Crowley grabbed his coat. "You think you won? They'll leave you. All of them. They'll see what kind of man you really are." Elias didn't look back. "I hope they do. And I hope they stay anyway." By morning, the bodies had been buried past the creek, under the cottonwoods. No markers. Just earth. Maybelle sat on Elias's lap as he stitched a tear in her doll. Her hands were steady now, her laugh light when he pretended to sew his own thumb. Rosie watched from the kitchen, her fingers idly smoothing flour into the table grain. Samuel came in with firewood, dusted in snow, and kissed her cheek as he passed. She smiled but didn't stop working. Jed and June hauled timber to the barn. They didn't speak, but they didn't have to. He handed her a saw. She handed him a nail. The rhythm between them was practiced, even gentle. June's face had softened when he wasn't looking. Elias walked out into the yard just before dusk. He lit his pipe, watched the smoke rise into the gold-pink sky. The land stretched quiet and wide. No gunmen. No ghosts. The letter came by courier days later. Railroad men again, try to buy what wasn't for sale. Promises of progress. Maps with future towns drawn like God's deciding fate. Elias burned the letter, without opening the second page. He didn't need more than what was already built. A house that stood through storm and fire, a barn that would grow again from ashes, a family stitched not by blood but by choice, scarred but still reaching forward. That night, he stood on the porch and listened. Laughter from the table, music from Samuel's harmonica. A lullaby hummed upstairs. It wasn't the sound of peace exactly, but it was a sound of belonging.